Yes, yes, hello. Welcome to Companion Piece, a semi-scripted side show extravaganza where you get to listen to me arguably unnecessarily exposit about things that ought to arguably speak for themselves. Today we're going to be talking about the background, technique, and theory surrounding the field on Ramsha, an oration in 7 parts, a longish piece of literary short fiction, possibly veering into slipstream at a couple points. We'll talk about that later. And story about a widower searching for his deceased spouse in the hills of Ireland. Now, why somebody would be searching for their deceased spouse, of course, is part of the whole main thrust of this story, which we'll talk about as well. And this is a very solemn, somber, and at times languorous piece that I hope is still beautiful enough to be of interest. Thanks. Let's get to it. So the field has the ignominy or acclaim, depending on your perspective, of being the piece of work in my entire pantheon of work that had the longest gestation period, 8 years. So 8 years from its initial inception to its final form that I read in the oration and that we're talking about right now. And in between, it simply sat on flash drives, external hard drives, desktops, laptops, in a Word document, traveling around with me as I traveled, waiting to be born. And I knew at the time that I wrote the initial paragraph that I hadn't yet done, felt, experienced, passed through whatever I had to pass through in order to find the language necessary to articulate this strange blend of feelings that the main character is going through. This combination of ardor, contrition, awe, adoration, and almost religious-like ecstasy. When it was ready to come, I knew that it was time. I pulled out the Word doc and just continued it from where I started. And it took about 2 weeks, 2 weeks of very intense, very difficult, very furious writing of me having to bring up and dredge up all these horrible feelings of grief and depression and sorrow and loneliness. There is a paragraph towards the end of the piece where the main character analogizes his wife again to a piece of nature and describes her as standing in the middle of a field, something like her hands are prophets interpreting a wind or a silken wind, something like that. And that paragraph, that passage, was the original form of the piece. And it was that and only that. And I knew at the moment that I wrote it, that single image, that I had an idea, a general idea of what the actual narrative would be about. This guy, seriously, just in a car, driving around Ireland, talking to locals, going to pubs, on the road, in towns, looking for his dead wife according to the precepts or rumors surrounding some piece of folklore. The field is a very personal piece to me, and I'm not even really sure why. I think because a lot of it is so figurative, I think I and you, of course, can place onto it whatever we ourselves want to get out of it, right? We can interpret and see within it whatever reflects or mirrors whatever we're going through. And I also think that the story is maybe the narrative and the language themselves are maybe just a method or a means to express some other experience that can find purchase and can best be articulated through the language and narrative of the piece itself. So I was very nervous about reciting this piece. I'm still nervous about talking about it. And when I read the field to myself in silence, it still makes me cry, right? And I'm the one who wrote the damn thing. So I not even sure if I really did it justice. I don't know. Hopefully I did at least a little bit. And I also apologize for the accents. I did not intend when beginning to read it out loud to try to inflect various types of Irish accents. And I have no idea if I did a good job. I probably did a terrible job. But I couldn't help it. There's something about the musicality of the Irish accent, no matter what the accent is, no matter what part of the country you're from. There's something about the musicality or lyricism of it, the flow of it, the cadence of it, that keyed into the emotions of the piece that I was trying to expunge and articulate. When looking at the setting, of course, it's set in Ireland, specifically the south and the somewhat westish part of the country. And I have been there. I've been to every single place that I wrote about in the story. I've been to Killarney, Kinlough, Cork, Limerick, Tralee, Sligo, Galway, Ballinskellig, Michael Skellig, which is the island off of the coast near Ballinskellig. Interestingly enough, which is where Luke in the last Star Wars movie was hanging out with the lightsaber, and he chucks it over his shoulder. That exact island right there. And also Inishmore, Inishmeen, Inishmere, if that's the name I'm remembering correctly. These small islands a little bit further north that at the time that I went were the place in the country that had the largest preponderance of people who spoke native Irish. And again, Irish I'm saying and not Gaelic because when I stayed there, the people who I stayed with used the word Irish to speak of the native pre-English language of the country. So that's what I'm using when I talk to you right now rather than Gaelic or some other term. So based on my trip out there, something about the experience must have been lodged in memory, waiting to be used for the future, and found a good way to be used in this story. I was able to pluck details from memory and from the journaling that I did at the time to fill gaps and to add to the verisimilitude of the piece. There's something about the place itself. There's some old, ancient feeling. It's such a beautiful, like catastrophically gorgeous country. Every single piece of it that I saw. I was absolutely in awe of the entire place when I went, and I think that feeling of awe right there tied in with the feeling of awe that the main character has for his wife and the idealized vision of her that he holds in his heart as he's going around looking for her, hoping that she might be resurrected or alive or kept whole in some way. Ireland was the place where it had to be written. It was the right place, and it was the only place. The location, the geography, the tenor of it, the history, the ancient, the ancient eroded hills, was the only place that this story could have come from. When looking at the characters of this piece, there's of course most prominently the main character, and there's all the smaller ancillary characters that he meets along the way. Now, I myself did not actually meet an old man in line in front of me going into a kirk, not castle, who turned around and talked to me. I did not meet somebody in a bed and breakfast who wanted to play chess with me. Those are contrivances or inventions of the fiction. But like I said, I did use sort of characteristics or traits, much like I did for the physical environment and the setting, to imbue these people with some quirks or tendencies that seem to be in line with those of the people who I did meet. As far as the main character himself, right, we don't actually know very much about him. He is unnamed, as I often like to do, and that is a reflection of how disempowered he feels in his relationship to the world and his surroundings and the circumstances of his life. He feels like his identity and his power, his control over himself has been enveloped. He comes across as fairly nondescript, I think, with not too many things that make him stand out except the occasional propensity towards snark. And that's also because nothing really matters to him except the search, right? He doesn't have any identity left except his search. We could argue that when he got off the plane, right when he stepped foot in Shannon Airport, he intended to die. He intended to commit suicide all along, and there are hints in the text that sort of allude to this. We could argue that that is very much the case. And if that is the case, and all of his actions are sort of a prolonged suicidal ideation and then an eventual enactment of his desire to pass away and be with his wife finally and ultimately, then we can say that his self, his sense of self, does not matter to the extent that he would not think about it, he would not wonder at the past, he would not feel the need to explain anything. He is firmly locked onto his course of action. He's firmly locked onto his quest. And he has no need to talk about, think about anything else except those few memories that he's latched onto that help him articulate his path, his desire, and his goal. As far as the other characters are concerned, they are this strange sort of rogues gallery of oddballs that he meets along the way, right? Who don't give him direct answers, at least in his mind, who may themselves not actually be literal people, but may be representations of various parts of this main character's own ego that are telling him to either continue on, wait, rethink things, go over here. So the entire story itself you could argue, is not only an example of an unreliable narrator, it could in fact be an example of, as I said at the top of this piece, slipstream, where not only does the main character have a tendency to misinterpret events, but the events that are happening around him may in fact not be real at all. He could be in some strange, nebulous, dissociated state of mind. Maybe he's just sitting back at home this entire story, and this journey that's being described is some inward way that he can come to a decision about what to do with his life. And if that is the case, then the people he comes across are, in fact, or could be, fragments or pieces of his ego, almost like a dream state, who are speaking out to him from his unconscious and reminding him of things, directing him subtly, not providing direct answers, but in the end, leading him on towards whatever he has ultimately decided to do. The Field is a great piece to use to discuss the difference between plot and story. The Field has a very muted plot, which allows a very pumped up story to come to the forefront. So when we talk about plot, what we're really talking about is the bulleted sequence of events that describes the cause and effect that propel the main character onward towards whatever resolution will allow him or her to understand or come to terms with their main conflict, right? And when we talk about the story, we're really talking about an encapsulated, paraphrased, one line, one or two line version of the narrative, where we can talk about what the main point or main purpose of the piece is, right? So if I ask you, what was that movie about? What was that book about? What is it about? And you start to tell me the specific events of the plot, well, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, then that's not really the right answer, is it? The sheer quantity or volume of relevant incidents that happened in a narrative does not make it good, or does not make the events meaningful in themselves, right? So if we can dial back on the plot and don't clutter it with stuff that happens, then we have a chance to take the actual style and essence, the central feeling of the text, and raise it up and allow us to abide there and dwell there for a while and get a sense of how the main character actually feels. That's exactly what I did with The Field. The actual plot points are few and far between. He goes to a bed and breakfast, he talks to somebody. He goes here, he talks to somebody. It's not like, well, he follows a clue from a bar, which leads him to a cairn, and in the cairn he finds a rune, and he takes the rune to some sort of mountainside and attenuates it to the light, and that opens a crypt, and he goes into the crypt and finds a message and a bottle from 500 years ago that sends him on a path through this valley, and then at the end of it, he gets into a car accident. Now instead, I was much more interested in taking the language and pushing it to the forefront and settling in on specific points of time, zooming in maybe a minute, maybe an hour, and expanding those so we can breathe within those wider frames of time. And it is very much a byproduct of this age, I feel, that people are so concerned with the literalism of what happens in a narrative. Folks have sort of been trained, it seems, to look for or want these highly mechanized clockwork stories, plots, where every piece fits together perfectly, and if you remove this one word or this one frame, then things collapse and don't make sense, so everything has to be essential. I don't really believe that is the most effective way for creative work to have an opportunity to be creative. I mean, why not be patient, pull back, let them do their thing, let it happen, accede to the work, let it do what it needs to do, let the creators carry out their vision, and allow things to happen rather than insist on them happening. So the question begs, what if all the advice from therapists, what if all the medication, all of the new hobbies, new habits, second professions, going back to school, all the advice, maxims, idioms, platitudes in the world don't do a single goddamn bit of good, and a person who is in pain cannot move beyond it. They cannot resolve it. They cannot get over it, giant air quotes. Time does not heal all wounds. What if that person succumbs or gives in to the pain? That is kind of the question that I wanted to explore with this piece. The insurmountability of grief. Is there a situation, is there a circumstance, somewhere, somehow, where somebody has been hurt so badly that there is no way to recover? I don't know. That's one of the main questions that I had in mind. So I see this entire piece kind of as a portrait of grief and pain and depression and recovery, and a snapshot of it. And when looking at other specific themes, one of them we can very, very easily see right off the bat is the purity or incorruptibility of nature. Throughout the piece, the main character analogizes his deceased wife to the natural world and sees her in it. He compares her features to it and imbues characteristics of his wife into the natural environment. He compares it to women, he compares the features of hills to shapes of the body, things like that. And it's as though the natural environment and the beauty of Ireland is embodied in the desire that he has for his wife and her recovery that can happen, her wholeness, her resurrection, so to speak. And that theme connects to another very prominent theme, and that is the corruptibility of the flesh, the fallibility of the body in this physical form. That we have to, this notion that we have to sort of move beyond the body and move beyond the flesh and find a place of pure, whole oneness that does not exist here in the material plane. And the final theme that you could perhaps say is apparent in this piece is the idealization of the other. And what that means is this man has become, the main character has become so interdependent on a set of behaviors, on a way of thinking and a way of living, that it's hard for him to extricate himself from that. And perhaps he has idealized his wife to the point where a separation of reality and imagination has happened. So when we look at technique and theory of the field, there are a couple pieces of literary tradition that I'm drawing inspiration from and that I really thought would best represent how the main character felt. One of them is lyric poetry. And for those of you who don't know, that's essentially poetry in the second person, where we, the reader, the viewer, are privy to some interaction that's happening between two people, but we only hear one side of it. We only hear the poet speaking off stage, off page, off camera, whatever, to some entity or person like, oh fate, oh wind, oh you, something like that. The idea behind lyric poetry being that the intensity of emotion is so severe and so strong that the only way to properly express it and articulate it is through this volcanic explosion of words in a very dramatic, perhaps hyperbolic sense. So we're focusing on the unignorable apparentness of language, like a poem, where language itself is pushed to the forefront and demands to be noticed as language, and demands to be seen as some sort of weird combination of words that you do not come across in daily life, that is the only way to express through aesthetics, flow, rhythm, cadence, pace, the experience that you're trying to encapsulate through the piece itself. The aesthetics and the style and the poetic nature of the writing is more relevant. It and what it does to your consciousness and what it does to you in making you think about the language itself is more relevant to the narrative than the specific concrete actions of those individuals who are in the story. And we could also have an unreliable narrator on our hands. The main character is clearly not in a solid state of mind. He's very frazzled, he's very upset, he's very saddened. So as he's going through the world, we really don't even know if he's recounting what's happening to him in an accurate way. The events that are actually happening to the main character are themselves perhaps not even real. Perhaps it's a dream, perhaps the entire thing is figurative, perhaps it's simply a way for the main character himself, much like me writing it, to undergo a process that articulates to him something that he can't otherwise understand except through the undergoing of the process itself and the discovery of the language and the physical terrain, the landscape that he is moving towards. The Field, a poetry prose piece about the destructive, transformative power of grief, where somebody resolves their inner conflict not through coming to terms with it, but through relenting to it. It is a piece about the relationship between beauty and pain, about how something can only be beautiful and can only therefore cause us pain if it is transient, if it is something that can be lost, and if it is something that has value and meaning to us. It's also a piece about the relationship between the beauty of a person and the beauty of a place, the beauty of memory and thought itself, and how those two things intertwine and expound on each other and raise each other to elevated state. And ultimately, The Field is a still frame of grief. It's a portrait, much like the portraits in the elderly woman's house, the bed and breakfast that the main character stays at, that portray a picture of a life that does not move, but it stays where it is and stuck at some point. What if somebody does not simply get better or move on or stabilize or develop proper coping methods? What does it look like if somebody dies before death? And how do we, in turn, need to be aware of that and be mindful of that? Thank you very much for watching, guys. I appreciate the support. It means the world to me. I hope this video was informative, instructive, educational to you, provided some insight into the writing process, the creative process in general. If you do support me on Patreon, you will be receiving an ebook version of this oration, The Field, in a format of your choice, as well as an audiobook for listening purposes in case you don't have a free hand to pick the story up and read it. Of course, feel free to subscribe, like, comment, follow me on the usual platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Goodreads. As always, happy reading, happy writing, happy creating, no matter what the medium. Take care, be well. I'm the Orator.